So we're going to go for the first propositions, please, Florian. So the first one, and this is slightly lengthy, but the distinction between the rural and the urban may very well be one of the oldest and most pervasive of geographical binaries, but is also one of the most misleading, as it suggests too great a focus on space and place rather than on time and relations. Oh.
These are much more difficult.
Well, you can only ask. Here we go. Let's have a. So let's start with Sally. Do you agree or disagree?
I agree.
You agree. Esther.
Yeah, I'd have to agree as well.
Okay. Let's. Henk.
As a sociologist, you have to agree. And you
Yeah, I thought so.
I guess.
Yandao.
Yeah, maybe disappointing, but yes, I agree.
Okay. So that's okay. So we've scratched geography. We'll move on. The second proposition, the equation of rural with agriculture and now with food has been a historical mistake. Sally.
I disagree.
You disagree. Esther.
Yeah, I wanted to spice it up, but I also want to disagree. So.
Yeah, okay. Spicy Henk.
I almost agree. Yeah?
Almost.
Yeah.
Okay, and Yandao.
Okay,
It's a difficult question.
this is a difficult one.
Yeah.
We chose them because they were difficult.
Yes, of course, it's a historical mistake, but as a mistake, it became very real and it made itself true. So, what do you want?
So Sally, no, let's go to the third proposition. I'm so tempted to just jump in there. So the third proposition, Florian. I agree with the United Nations declaration that the future of the world's population is urban. So, Sally.
I don't know how anybody could agree with that.
Yeah.
No.
Right. Okay, Esther.
Yeah, okay, I agree then. Yeah.
You agree with that? Henk?
No.
No.
Absolutely not.
Good,
No.
we're finding some dissent.
Yeah.
Yandao?
No.
No. Okay, that's excellent. Thank you very much. Right, let's get into some detail. We're going to start with where I think there's some energy, which is I agree with the United Nations Declaration. And Sally, you said that the world's future isn't urban. Can you expand?
I think a very uniform, built-up urban world with no people living in rural areas. I think it would be very boring. I cannot see how we would not always have a need for a rural connection. So.
That's very pithy, very good. Esther?
Yeah, no, of course I agree with what Sally said, but and I also think that the statement doesn't really say that there isn't a rule in there, because I think most people live in urban areas, and I think that this trend will continue. So cities will grow. Of course, that doesn't mean that we don't need the rural space and that we don't need people living there, but I do think that more and more attention will actually be going to cities, because that is where most people live and also where most people who need to be fed live.
Perfect, thank you. So Henk?
My first disagreement is I don't like to follow the dichotomy urban versus rural. We should just leave that dichotomy, and we should start from thinking from a kind of multiplicity of rurals and urbans, and look at the interrelations between the rural and the urban, and then you can start talking in terms of urbanization, but also ruralization, and ruralization can take place within the urban, etc., etc. So then this statement in its overall message is completely wrong, I would say.
Okay, so that's a rejection of that binary and looking for something that's a kind of hybridity of urban expanses that are ruralized and urban-rural. So it all gets mixed up. Yandao.
Yeah, I completely agree, and let me illustrate that with two anecdotes. Well, not anecdotes really. There is this beautiful book of Beasley and Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything. And implicitly it makes clear as well that the first cities in this world, long time ago, have been created by peasants. It was born out of the countryside, and especially peasant women played a very important role. So that's the first anecdote. The second one is from everyday life of the Netherlands. When on Sunday you will enjoy life with your children, you often take the bike. And what do on bike? You go outside of the city. Nobody makes a turn around the church and then another turn and so on. Yeah, we go back to the rural. So there is, as Henk said, there's a multiplicity, interpenetrating, there's dialectics, they need each other. There's no, in that sense, no dichotomy. The real question is, why is it often suggested to be a dichotomy, and why, following this dichotomy, is so often, is the rural neglected? Once again, and then there are painful events like the war in the Ukraine, and before the 2008 crisis Haroon referred to. Yeah, these painful events make the arrogant ones realize that, hey, there's something like the rural. And that then is a nightmare, evidently.
Yeah, no, and I think Haroon made a very powerful point that
Exactly.
actually this equation that the majority, as Esther said, of people living in urban areas as opposed to rural areas, but there are numerically more people than ever living in rural areas. So it's an interesting thing that we kind of neglect that kind of aspect. So that's fascinating. So that's, I think, takes us to the equation of the rural with agriculture and now with food has been a historical mistake. Now, Sally and Esther both said no. So do you want, let's have an exploration of that. Sally, do you want to go first?
Yeah, in fact, I'd almost phrase the question differently. What
Of course.
Yeah, what I sometimes now see as a problem is that rural studies is seen to not include agriculture and food. And I think that's the problem. And I think it may well stem from the way rural development funding was set up, through the European Union, that it was separate to Pillar 1. Pillar 1 was about agriculture and food, and Pillar 2 was about rural development. And yeah, I sometimes worry that rural sees itself as something different to agriculture and food. So I don't think it's a historical mistake. I think it's a current problem.
Okay,
Sorry,
Esther.
what was the statement again?
So let's go. Can you go back, Florian? I can say it. The equation of rural with agriculture and now with food has been a historical mistake.
And I disagreed, right?
Yeah. Look, it's okay. You can change your mind. Jess changed her mind.
I think
everybody can change their mind. It's okay.
I think why I did so is also what Henk said before. It's not so simple. It's not like, there's different ruralities, there's different urban whatevers. So I think it's a bit more like a mosaic rather than the statement seems to suggest that it's a simple dichotomy. And I think that's the reason why I disagreed.
Okay. But Sally's point about how policy and maybe commerce and other things recreate this kind of and reinforce this. Is there something in that we should unpick so we can see that multiplicity? It's called the common agricultural policy.
Yeah.
And I know there's nothing common agricultural or a policy about it, but...
Yeah, I don't know if I can say something about it, but because most of my work is on the urban, but I see there that, of course, lots of people are also growing food. So it's not like the urban is completely non-food. Food is also being produced in the city, smaller scale and larger scale. And we also found that even if it's very small scale, for many people that is actually very interesting, and they do want to grow, even if it's like one fruit tree in their garden, and that does give them a lot of joy and sense of fulfillment. So I think in that sense, food is also an urban issue.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Now, Henk, I think you were sat on the fence on this.
As I almost agreed as far as I remember. Yes, I think, again, starting from a more relational perspective on the rural and the urban, then the rural is being reproduced as much in the urban as in the rural. So then this equation is no longer real anymore. So that's a lot of, and also if you focus on rural dynamics and rural histories, then the non-food activity has been always been of highly important. So in that sense, there is a kind of historical neglect of all the other rural activities that took place and take place. And that is at the moment probably even more than it has been in the history.
Yeah, now that's really interesting because I think that picks up on this kind of multiplicity of the rural. Because in the past, the rural used to be a source of fuel through wood, or peat in some areas, used to be a source of fibre. You know, when you think about the terrifying problem that we have with kind of waste clothing, that we have enough clothing, I think, in storage to clothe everybody several times, let alone what we keep. So we have just this idea of agriculture being about food, a very kind of mono vision of what this is. Now, Jan Douwe, you immediately leapt into not just an answer, but several sentences. Do you want to keep going on that theme about how this has become a reality?
Yeah, well, the following your argument about food and fibers, the place where I came from, the rural was also used to hide arms for the resistance during the war. Sounds probably a bit crazy, this reference. It tells a story. It tells that the rural is a place to be defended. The rural is a place that allows for being defended. The rural harbors people who actually defend it. And during the same war, many people came to the countryside to hide there as well. Now, this was in a specific time, space, location. But I would argue that jumping over the boundaries of this specific situation, the rural generally has represented a range of values to mankind. It has been a part of civilization. Look, if you enter into the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, our national museum, the amount of paintings you see about the countryside, about cows, about working people. If you go to the Van Gogh museum, the amount of people you see working, doing farming work. Look to the lines Van Gogh has written about it. I mean, it's a part of our culture, our cultural heritage also. So yes, but then why the question again returns: whom is neglecting these values? Why are they hijacking the rural? And why are they neglecting that the rural, in the end, is the cradle of co-production, the permanent interaction and mutual transformation of man and living nature, and agriculture being the main part of it. And that part is definitely not a mistake, but at the heart of the rural.
That's great. That's fascinating to hear that defense of the role of the rural as culture, as kind of sanctuary, because certainly as a rural dweller myself, I noticed during the pandemic that we were joined by lots of people who didn't normally live in the countryside, who decided that cities were no longer the place to be, which was funny because they used to like them. But Esther, do you want to say something in defense of the urban or urbans? You know, go on. I'll give you just a small task.
Nou ja, I think all of these things also that Jan Douwe says is true, of course. But yeah, it depends on what you look on. If you study the rural, then of course you see all these great things that the rural is producing and is offering also to humanity. But then, if you look the other way, maybe we shouldn't be seeing those two ways. But if you look at the urban, then of course you also see lots of things that urban areas produce and reach for cities. But I don't think that you're disputing that. So it's just what your focus is on. And of course, we're here on a Rural Sociology Group, so of course we're going to applaud the rural.
I'm inviting you to kind of, you know, you can leave quickly if you need to.
But it's also about relations, as Han also said in his talk, right? We have a rural because we also have an urban. So I think it's good to look at what both sides have to offer the other.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's something in this that's particularly like a Dutch and British kind of experience of urban and rural, where, you know, in many other places they would describe our rurality as ex-urban, that actually we're never very far from a city. we're never very far from a train line. You know, many people in, say, North America or Asia would kind of go, that ain't rural. You know, it's not properly rural. So is there just a reflection of this kind of multiplicity of ruralities? Sally, do you want to say anything?
I'm really glad you're inviting an Irish person to talk about the British notion of the rural.
It was slightly deliberate.
Yeah, and this concept of rural proofing that is British. You know, this idea of the disadvantaged rural when you have people who own 136,000 acres. You know, so yeah, I think it is a peculiar kind of notion. I think it maybe goes back to the Industrial Revolution, the romanticized rural, the kind of happy peasants, and then this idea of the disadvantaged rural. So it's kind of leading into the next question of that urban-rural dichotomy, the binary, which I think is really problematic. And I think the big thing you miss out is that whole examination of social class.
And that's something I'm very conscious of in this multiplicity of rurals that Henk was speaking about. That, you know, I live in a part of the rural southwest which has idyllic villages. Don't pretend that they're not.
Unaffordable?
Unaffordable. Other villages are racked with poverty and food banks. Some villages, basically, they close the gate and they just wallow in their privilege. So it's this multiplicity of rurals. So let's move back to that first proposition from Professor Woods. The distinction between the rural and the urban may be one of the oldest and most pervasive of geographical binaries, but is also one of the most misleading. So that's where we all agree that we're not geographers. But let's think about that sort of question that's actually been latent and we've been kicking around here about relations. Sally, do you want to say something more about those urban-rural relations, particularly in relation to class and social distinctions in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us will find that binary, and you know, Hans spoke about it. It's very difficult. We miss out social class. We miss out, I think, a lot more of the social processes that define our chances, our resources, and so on. And it's even what you've just said, Matt, about, you know, the privileged and the underprivileged rural. And I think those are the more interesting questions.
Great, thank you. So I think that's really important in when we start to talk about this kind of question of structured inequalities and the rural. And that kind of also comes up, doesn't it, in agriculture and in farming studies that's sometimes kind of misplaced. And we heard Haroon talking about peasants, but in a Western European, northern kind of venture, that doesn't always work so well. So let's see, Jan Douwe, do you want to say something about that kind of mapping of class and inequality onto agriculture and our understanding of it?
Yes, there is, of course, this intersectionality of the countryside, the towns, class, ethnicity, often the privileged, underprivileged, the ones who can afford the beautiful and the charming things, and the others who are excluded. Food every now and then runs through it. And through all this, there runs another storyline that is farming being farming as activity. I'm not talking about agriculture as a kind of system, but farming as an activity that involves actors, men and women, and who construct autonomy to have the room to carve new pathways forward in and through farming. Continuously they are designing new ways of farming. And as a matter of fact, over the last 3-4 decades, it is breathtaking. We have seen how farmers themselves, by constructing rural development activities, all kinds of multifunctionality, Henk wrote about it, making new institutions, have escaped from this dilemma of the past of grow bigger or leave. Yeah, there is now a clearly new development line. It's amazing. It was born from the inside. And they are repatterning the agriculture, and repatterning the relations with the countryside, and even repatterning issues of relative prosperity and relative poverty. So we have to keep in mind the dynamics of all this, and that again refers to social struggle. Yeah, this is not done according to a story that comes from the clouds. No, it's about dreams and about social struggle. It's about interests. It's about anger, also about rage. Who the hell do they think that I have to leave? And this comes, of course, very close to the current problems in the Netherlands, to the nitrogen policy. People getting bloody upset, that they are told to leave, well, let me not expand on that.
No. I think we all understand that passion about people who are rooted and part of a community and all of those things, and they're precious. So, but we could go on for more, and we really should. But unfortunately, the electric vehicle of time has run to our boundary. Its battery is discharged for this panel. So, thank you all very much for these great contributions and a great dialogue. Thank you.